There are households that take their cues from the people who run them. And there are households that take their cues from the people who are absent. The Merston estate, in the 3 weeks that the Duke was away, took its cues from neither. It simply did what households do when no one is watching closely enough, when the person who should be watching is somewhere on the road between here and Edinburgh, writing dutiful letters about the weather. It showed its true face. Margaret Ashworth had lived in the Merston estate for 6 months by the time it happened. 6 months of long corridors and correct dinners, and the particular silence of a house that was not yet hers. That was not sure. She sometimes thought whether it intended to become hers. She had learned the house's rhythms the way you learned the rhythms of any place that tolerated you without welcoming you, carefully, quietly, without drawing attention to the learning. She had learned other things too, which rooms were warm and which were not, which of the household staff met her eyes and which did not, which silences in the dining room were ordinary and which were something else. She was by most measures accustomed to silence. She had chosen it for most of her life over the alternative. Words, she had found, were frequently wasted, spent on things that didn't require them, deployed in rooms that didn't deserve them. She had developed, over years of careful observation, a preference for saying nothing unless she had something worth saying. This preference had been, in the Merston estate, occasionally mistaken for other things. On the morning of the 14th day of Oliver's absence, she came downstairs and walked the east corridor to the breakfast room as she did every morning. She stopped. The portrait was facing the wall. It had hung at the end of the east corridor since the week after their wedding. Oliver's commission, his idea, his insistence that the east corridor was the right place for it. A formal portrait painted quickly, competent without being remarkable. She had not loved it particularly, but it had been hers in the way that very little else in the Merston estate was yet hers. Now it faced the wall. She stood in the corridor and looked at it. The back of a canvas, the wooden frame, the small hook from which it hung, unchanged as though nothing had changed except the direction. She stood there for a long moment. Then she continued to the breakfast room, sat down, poured her tea, drank it. She said nothing to anyone. She would say nothing about it for the next 14 days. But she did not forget it. She had never in her life forgotten anything that mattered. She had not, when she married Oliver Ashworth, expected it to be easy. This was not pessimism. It was accuracy. She was 24 years old and had been observing the world with sufficient care for long enough to understand that most things that were presented as simple were not, and that the gap between the presented version and the actual version was where most of the interesting and most of the difficult things lived. The marriage had been arranged in the way that arrangements were arranged, through solicitors and family connections and the particular social mathematics that operated beneath every drawing room in England, adding and subtracting fortunes and names and bloodlines until something that looked like a sensible outcome emerged. Her family had the name. Oliver's family had, in recent generations, accumulated the means to support one. It was not a love match. It had not been presented as one. She had met Oliver 3 times before the wedding. He was 31, quiet in the way that men of his position were sometimes quiet, not from temperament but from authority, the ease of a man who had never needed to fill a room because the room arranged itself around him. He was not unkind. He was not warm. He was, she had assessed across 3 meetings, a man who had not yet decided what he thought of her, and who was honest enough not to perform a decision he hadn't made. She had respected that. She had come to the Merston estate in October in the rain in a carriage that smelled of damp wool, and she had looked out the window at the long approach through the grounds and thought, "This is where I live now," not with dread, not with joy, with the particular clear-eyed attention she brought to new information. The house was large. The corridors were long. The staff were 12 in number, organized with the precision of people who had been operating a system for a long time and had no particular interest in adjusting it for a new arrival. Mrs. Holt had met her at the door. She was perhaps 55, with the posture of someone who had spent 30 years being correct, and the eyes of someone who was currently assessing whether this new development would require adjustment. She had welcomed Margaret with impeccable politeness, the kind of politeness that was a category of its own, that communicated welcome while communicating, in a register just below audibility, that the welcome was provisional. Margaret had thanked her, followed her inside, said nothing she didn't need to say. In the weeks that followed, she had learned the house by moving through it slowly, without announcement, in the way of someone who was not attempting to claim territory but simply to understand it. The library was on the second floor, west side, and was very good. The morning room faced south and was warm until 11. The kitchen garden had been neglected in autumn, and she had ideas about it. The east corridor was cold in the afternoons because the window at the far end had a gap in its seal that someone had addressed with a folded cloth in the third drawer of the oak cabinet, a solution so specific it could only have been arrived at through years of trial. She noted all of this. She said none of it aloud. Oliver was present for the first 2 months, present in the physical sense in the house, at the dinner table, in the library occasionally. Their evenings followed a pattern that had established itself without discussion. Dinner, which was correct and moderately conversational. Afterward, a separation that was comfortable rather than cold, he to his study, she to her reading, with no particular sense of obligation in either direction. He was not avoiding her. She was not avoiding him. They were two people who had not yet learned how to be in the same room without the structure of a social occasion to organize them. She was patient about this. She had always been patient. The portrait had gone up in the east corridor in the second week of November at Oliver's instruction. She had come upon it one morning, had turned the corner and found it there, already hung, the paint still slightly new. She had stood in front of it for a moment. It was a reasonable likeness. The painter had captured her stillness at least, if not what lived behind it. "Do you like it?" Oliver had asked, appearing behind her. She had considered the question honestly. "It's good work," she had said. He had looked at her for a moment. Then he had nodded and walked on. She had never been sure whether he had wanted a different answer. Oliver left for Edinburgh on the 3rd of December. He told her the evening before business, a legal matter relating to a property dispute that had been pending for 2 years and required his personal attention. He was sorry for the timing. He expected to be away 3 weeks, perhaps 4. "Is there anything you need before I go?" he asked. She had thought about the question carefully, as she thought about most questions. "No," she said. He had looked at her for a moment in the particular way he sometimes did, as though he were reading a page in a language he was still learning, following the words without complete confidence in the meaning. "I'll write," he said. "Thank you," she said. He left the following morning before she came downstairs. The house changed after he left. Not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to and named in a single sentence. It changed the way a room changed when someone removed a piece of furniture, and the whole arrangement subtly shifted, and you understood only gradually that what felt wrong was a specific absence you hadn't registered before. Mrs. Holt's instructions to the staff became slightly more audible. The small adjustments to Margaret's preferences that had been implemented in the first weeks, her preferred tea, the fire in her reading room, the arrangement of the breakfast table, began, one by one, to quietly revert. Not overnight. Gradually, plausibly, in the way of things that could always be attributed to oversight. Margaret noticed each one. She said nothing. She had been saying nothing for 6 months, and she was skilled at it in the way that people became skilled at things they practiced daily. Silence was not, for her, the absence of response. It was a response. It was the specific, chosen, deliberate act of a woman who understood that the moment she named something aloud she would be required to defend it, and that in this house, with this audience, the defense would exhaust her before the argument had fairly begun. So she watched, and she noted, and she moved through the house with her usual unhurried composure, and she said nothing. On the morning of the 14th day, she walked the east corridor and found the portrait facing the wall. She stood in front of it, the back of a canvas, the wooden frame, the small hook unchanged. She was aware, in the way she was aware of most things, of what this meant. Not who had done it. She did not need to know who had done it, because the answer was less important than the fact of it. The fact was simple. She had been in this house for 6 months, and in the 3 weeks since her husband had left, the house had decided to tell her something. Clearly, visibly, in the east corridor where she walked every morning. You do not belong here. She stood in front of the portrait for a long time. Then she touched the frame lightly with 2 fingers, the way you touch something to confirm it was real. The wood was cold. The portrait was solid. It existed in its reversed position with complete indifference to how she felt about it. She took her hand away. She continued to the breakfast room, sat, poured her tea. The tea was slightly too weak. This had been happening for 4 days. She drank it anyway. Mrs. Holt appeared in the doorway at 8:30 with the morning's correspondence and the expression she wore when she was being correct at someone. She placed the letters on the table. She asked whether breakfast was satisfactory. She waited. Margaret looked at her. Mrs. Holt was 55 years old and had been running this household for 17 of them, and had, in that time, developed the particular confidence of someone who understood exactly where the power in a room resided. She met Margaret's eyes without difficulty, without flinching, with the composed certainty of a woman who had assessed the situation and found herself comfortable with the outcome. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "Breakfast is fine," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Holt." Mrs. Holt withdrew. Margaret looked at the correspondence. Oliver's letter was on top. She recognized his handwriting. She opened it. Read it. He was well. The matter was proceeding. Edinburgh was cold. He hoped she was comfortable. She folded the letter, placed it with the others she had kept in her reading room, in the small drawer of the writing desk, in date order. That afternoon, she went to the writing desk and took out a fresh sheet of paper. She wrote to Oliver, 3 paragraphs, the garden, a book she had finished, a question about the property adjacent to the east field that she had been meaning to ask. She wrote clearly, correctly, in her small, precise hand. She did not mention the portrait. She sealed the letter, set it on the tray for posting. Then she sat for a moment at the desk, in the quiet of the afternoon, listening to the house around her, the creak of a floorboard somewhere above, the distant sound of something in the kitchen, the draft from the east corridor that found its way, even here, through the gaps in the old walls. She opened the small drawer of the writing desk. She took out a fresh piece of paper, smaller, not correspondence paper, a notebook page. She picked up her pen. At the top she wrote the date. Below it, in the same small, precise hand, portrait turned, east corridor, day 14. She looked at what she had written. Then she folded the page and placed it at the back of the drawer beneath the letters. She closed the drawer. She picked up her book and began to read. The Dowager Duchess Emma Ashworth arrived on a Tuesday. No advance notice. A letter had come the previous Friday. Margaret had read it, noted the date, said nothing. The letter had been addressed to Mrs. Holt. This was the first thing. Margaret had understood in the 6 months since her arrival that the Merston estate operated on 2 parallel systems of communication. There was the official system, correspondence addressed to the Duke, or in his absence to the Duchess, opened at the breakfast table, responded to in due course. And there was the other system, which ran beneath it like a second river beneath the ground, channeling information through Mrs. Holt and back to Londra and forward again, in a current that Margaret could feel but had never been able to map entirely. The letter on Friday had gone directly to Mrs. Holt's sitting room. Margaret had seen it in passing. She had not asked about it. On Tuesday morning, the dowager's carriage came up the drive at 10:30, and by 11 o'clock, Emma Ashworth was standing in the entrance hall of the house she had lived in for 30 years before her son's marriage made it, technically, someone else's. She was 63, tall, precise, silver-haired, with the particular posture of a woman who had spent her entire life being correct and had found it, on balance, effective. She wore dark blue and a brooch that Margaret recognized as having come from the cabinet in the upstairs drawing room, a cabinet that was, technically, part of the estate's contents and therefore technically Margaret's to manage. She had taken it with her to London in October. Margaret had noted this. She had said nothing. "Margaret," Emma said, in the tone she used for Margaret's name, not unkind, not cold, simply precise, in the manner of someone identifying an object in a room. "I hope you don't mind. Oliver mentioned the Eastfield dispute, and I thought it sensible to be on hand." Oliver had not mentioned this to Margaret. "Of course," Margaret said. "Welcome, Your Grace." Emma moved through the house with the ease of someone who had never stopped thinking of it as hers. This was not aggressive. It was simply natural, the unself-conscious navigation of a person in a familiar space, touching things as she passed them, rearranging a vase in the morning room without apparent awareness that she had done it, pausing in the library to remove a book from the shelf and replace it 2 shelves lower in a position that made no particular sense to Margaret but had presumably made sense to someone once. Margaret watched all of this. She said nothing. On the first afternoon, Emma called Mrs. Holt into the downstairs sitting room and closed the door. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Margaret was in the library, directly above, and could hear the rise and fall of voices but not the words. When Mrs. Holt emerged, her bearing had the particular quality of someone who had just been reminded of something they had not forgotten. That evening, the dinner menu was different from what Margaret had arranged. She sat at the table and ate what was served and said nothing about the difference. "Cook tells me you've been making changes," Emma said, midway through the first course. Conversational, light, the tone of someone raising a subject they had already decided the outcome of. "Small ones," Margaret said. "Oliver has always preferred things a particular way." "Yes," Margaret said, "I'm learning that." Emma looked at her, the assessing look, the jeweler's look. Margaret held it without difficulty. After a moment, Emma returned to her soup. "You're very quiet," Emma said. "Yes," Margaret said. "Oliver always preferred quiet women." A pause, the pause of someone placing a word carefully. "I'm glad you at least have that quality." The dining room held this sentence for a moment. Margaret looked at Emma. Not quickly, not sharply, the long, level look she brought to most things, the one that had no edge to it and therefore gave nothing to push against. She held it for what she judged to be 3 full seconds. Then she picked up her wine and drank. She said nothing. Across the table, Emma's composure held, but something in it had shifted in a way that was very small and very visible to someone paying close enough attention. A slight recalibration. The adjustment of a woman who had expected a reaction and received instead a quality of attention she had not anticipated and was not entirely sure how to categorize. Margaret set down her wine. She asked Mrs. Holt to bring more bread. Mrs. Holt's management of the household in Emma's presence was a masterwork of invisible communication. Nothing was said directly. Nothing was ever said directly, that was, Margaret had come to understand, the entire point. The system that operated through Mrs. Holt was effective precisely because it left no record, generated no confrontation, provided nothing that could be named or addressed or defended against. It worked through omission, through timing, through the arrangement of small details in patterns that were only legible if you were watching carefully enough. The fire in Margaret's reading room was allowed to go low before it was replenished. Her preferred hour for the morning room was suddenly occupied by Emma's correspondence. The housekeeper's daily report, which had been delivered to Margaret every morning since Oliver's departure, was, on the third day of Emma's visit, delivered instead to Emma's room. Margaret noted each one. She went to her reading room each evening and took out the small, folded pages from the back of the drawer. She added to them in her small, precise hand. Dates, times, specifics. She was building something that had no name yet but that she understood, in the way she understood most things before she had language for them to be important. On the fourth day she found Dora, or rather, Dora found her. Dora was 19, the newest of the household staff, hired in September before Margaret's arrival, and therefore not yet fully absorbed into the system the way the others were. She had the wide, watchful eyes of someone who was still learning the rules and had not yet decided which ones she intended to follow. Margaret was in the kitchen garden on the fourth morning, the one place in the Merston estate that felt, for reasons she could not entirely articulate, most like hers. The garden had been left to itself in autumn and she had been quietly taking stock of it. What had survived, what had not, what might be recovered in spring with the right attention. She heard footsteps on the path and turned. Dora stopped. She had clearly not expected to find anyone in the garden. She was carrying a basket and wearing the expression of someone who had been sent somewhere, and was now uncertain whether this was still the correct somewhere. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said. "I didn't know you were." "It's fine," Margaret said. Dora nodded, made to turn. "What's in the basket?" Margaret asked. Dora turned back. "Kitchen scraps, ma'am, for the compost." Margaret looked at the garden. "The heap is at the far end," she said, "past the apple trees." "Oh," Dora looked in the direction Margaret indicated. "I didn't know." "Most people don't," Margaret said. "It was badly positioned. Someone moved it in October." She had moved it herself, quietly, on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks after her arrival, when it had become apparent that its original position shaded the south-facing beds unnecessarily. She had not told anyone. It had simply been done. Dora went to the far end, deposited the scraps, came back. She hesitated at the gate. "Ma'am," she said, "can I ask the compost, do you want it turned?" Margaret looked at her. "Do you know how?" "My grandmother had a kitchen garden," Dora said. "I helped her." Margaret considered this. "Thursday," she said, "if you have time." Dora nodded. She seemed, Margaret thought, slightly surprised not by the request but by the conversation itself, by the fact of having been spoken to in this particular way. She went back to the house. Margaret turned back to the garden. She stood in it for a while, in the pale December light, looking at the bare beds and the apple trees and the compost heap at the far end, thinking about what could be recovered, given the right attention and enough time. Emma called for her on the 6th afternoon. Not a request, a summons, conveyed through Mrs. Holt with the polished indirection of someone who understood that the form mattered as much as the content. The dowager wondered if Margaret might have a moment. The dowager was in the upstairs sitting room. Margaret put down her book, went upstairs. Emma was at the writing desk when Margaret entered, seated, turned slightly, with the air of a woman who had been interrupted from something important. The sitting room had been subtly rearranged since Margaret had last been in it. Small things. The chair nearest the window, which Margaret used, had been moved to the less comfortable position nearer the door. Margaret took the chair by the door. Emma looked at her for a moment, then she set down her pen. "I want to speak to you about the household accounts," she said. "Oliver has always left them to me when he's away." "I see," Margaret said. "I imagine he didn't tell you." "No," Margaret said, "he didn't." "It's simply a matter of efficiency," Emma said. "I know the estate. I know the suppliers. There's no reason to create confusion by changing a system that works." Margaret looked at her. Emma had framed this well. It was framed as helpfulness, as experience, as a reasonable preference for continuity. It was also, beneath the framing, something else entirely, a clear and direct statement about where the management of this house resided and where it did not. Margaret understood this completely. She thought about the accounts she had been keeping in the small desk drawer. Not the household accounts, those had never been formally handed to her, and she had not pressed for them, because pressing for things was not her method. But the other accounts, the small folded pages. "Of course, Your Grace," she said, "whatever is most useful to Oliver." Emma nodded. Something in her expression adjusted, the satisfaction of a woman who had expected resistance and found none, which was its own kind of miscalculation. "Good," she said. "I thought you'd be sensible about it." Margaret stood. "Will that be all?" Emma picked up her pen. "Yes. Thank you, Margaret." Margaret went to the door. She put her hand on the frame. "Your Grace," she said. Emma looked up. "The brooch you're wearing," Margaret said. "The one from the cabinet upstairs. I'd like it returned to the cabinet before you go." The room was very quiet. Emma's expression did not change. Not precisely. But something behind it did, a rapid, careful reassessment, the recalibration of a woman who had made an error of intelligence about the person she was dealing with. "Of course," Emma said after a moment. "Thank you," Margaret said. She went back downstairs, went to her reading room, sat at the small desk. She took out the folded pages, added to the most recent one. Then she sat for a long time, looking at the window, thinking about the specific and particular exhaustion of being correctly, calmly, impeccably present in a house that was doing everything it could think of to make her feel otherwise. She was not defeated. She wanted to be clear about this, at least to herself. She was not defeated, not frightened, not even particularly surprised. She had understood the shape of this from the first morning she had walked the east corridor and found the portrait facing the wall. She was tired. That was different. She had not, before this year, understood how much it cost to say nothing, day after day, in rooms where the nothing was required to do the work of everything. Emma left on the 10th day. She left in the mid-morning, with Mrs. Holt seeing her to the carriage, and two of the other staff carrying her bags with the efficiency of long practice. Margaret stood in the entrance hall and said the correct things. "It had been a pleasure. Please give my regards. Safe travels." Emma paused at the door. She looked at Margaret for a moment, the long assessing look, the jeweler's look. Then something in it shifted. Not warmth, but something more like accuracy. "You are not," Emma said very quietly, "what I expected." Margaret looked at her. "No," she said, "I don't suppose I am." Emma went. The carriage went down the drive. Margaret watched from the window until it turned the corner and disappeared behind the oaks. Then she went upstairs to the cabinet in the drawing room and opened it. The brooch was there, replaced sometime in the last 2 days without comment. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the cabinet and went back to her reading room. That evening she went to the small desk and took out the folded pages. She read through them from the beginning, all of them in order, from the day the portrait had been turned. She read them carefully, as she read everything, with the full attention of a woman who understood that the meaning of a thing was sometimes in the accumulation rather than in any single entry. Then she put them away. She sat in the quiet room. She thought about Oliver's last letter, which had arrived that morning. The dispute was progressing. He hoped to return within the week. He hoped she was comfortable. She took out a fresh sheet of paper. She wrote 3 paragraphs. The garden, a question about the East Field drainage, 1 sentence about the weather. She did not mention Emma's visit. She sealed the letter. Then she sat for a long time in the room that was hers and not hers, in the house that was hers and not hers, while the December dark came down outside the window, and the fire burned at exactly the temperature of acceptable. And she thought, with the clear, patient, unhurried attention she brought to all important questions about how much longer she intended to do this. Oliver wrote well. This was one of the things Margaret had learned about her husband in 6 months of marriage, that he expressed himself more clearly on paper than in person, with a precision and care that his face didn't always show. His letters were thoughtful. They asked real questions. They noticed things about the world he was moving through and reported them with the dry, observational humor of a man who was more interested in what he saw than in how he appeared seeing it. She had read every letter twice. Sometimes 3 times. She had never told him this. His first letter from Edinburgh had arrived 5 days after his departure. 3 pages closely written. The journey. The city which was colder than he remembered. The solicitors involved in the dispute, one of whom was brilliant and one of whom was, he wrote, the most comprehensively wrong person I have encountered in a professional context, which is a competitive field. He hoped she was settling in comfortably. He hoped Mrs. Holt was managing well. She had read this letter at the breakfast table, alone, in the thin December light. Mrs. Holt is managing very well, she had thought. She had written back about the garden. The letters established a rhythm of their own, his arriving every 4 or 5 days, hers going out on Tuesdays and Fridays regardless of whether there was a letter to answer. She was, she recognized, more consistent in her correspondence than he was. This said something, though she was not yet ready to determine exactly what. His 4th letter asked, "Is the house treating you well?" She had held this question for a long time. It was a real question, she could tell from the way he had phrased it, that he meant it as a real question, not a pleasantry. He had put it in the middle of the letter, not at the end where pleasantries went, and he had given it its own line, which was not how he formatted pleasantries. She sat at the writing desk and looked at it. "Is the house treating you well?" She thought about the portrait in the east corridor, which was now in its 22nd day of facing the wall. She thought about the fire in her reading room, allowed to go low each evening before someone attended to it. She thought about Emma's visit, unreported to Oliver by anyone as far as she could determine. She thought about the household accounts, quietly redirected. She thought about the brooch in the cabinet. She thought about all the things she had not said and why she had not said them and whether not saying them was the right decision or simply the habitual one. Then she picked up her pen. "The house," she wrote, "is very well maintained." She looked at this sentence. It was true. The Merston estate was impeccably maintained. The floors, the silver, the grounds, the endless correct operation of a large house that had been running on the same systems for 30 years. It was very well maintained. It was also not an answer to the question he had asked. She knew this. She suspected he would know it too if he was paying close enough attention. Whether he was paying close enough attention was a question she had not yet resolved. She finished the letter, posted it on Tuesday. She had been trying since October to understand Oliver. Not to judge him, judgment required a completed picture, and she did not yet have one. Simply to understand what he was, as distinct from what she had been presented with and what she had assumed and what she had observed and what she had inferred. These were 4 different things, and the work of a marriage, she had come to believe, was the slow, patient process of sorting them. What she had been presented with, a man of 31, good family, sound estate, quiet manner, sensible, respectable. What she had assumed, someone who had consented to this arrangement with the same clear-eyed practicality she had, who understood what it was and intended to manage it with equivalent realism. What she had observed, a man who was more present on paper than in person, who noticed things he didn't always remark on, who had commissioned her portrait and hung it in the East Corridor, and had then left for Edinburgh without asking whether the East Corridor was right or whether she had other preferences, because it had not occurred to him to ask. What she had inferred, that Oliver Ashworth had spent 31 years in a house organized by other people, first his mother, then Mrs. Holt on his mother's instructions, and had developed, in consequence, the particular blindness of someone who had never needed to see the machinery because the machinery had always simply run. He was not cruel. This was important and she held to it. He was not cold. He was not deliberately absent. He was a man who had not yet understood that the systems operating around him were not neutral, that they had been set in motion by people with preferences, and that his absence from Edinburgh had created a vacancy into which those preferences had expanded, as preferences always did when given room. He did not know about the portrait. She had not told him. She had thought about this frequently in the 3 weeks since she had found it. Why she hadn't told him? The obvious answer was that telling him would require her to name it, to say someone in your household turned my portrait to face the wall while you were away, and that naming it would require him to respond, and that his response would reveal something she was not sure she was ready to know. Whether he would believe her, whether he would act, whether he would look at Mrs. Holt and see what Margaret saw, or whether he would see what he had always seen, which was a woman who ran his house correctly and competently and had done so for 17 years. She was not ready to know the answer. Not yet. She found Dora in the kitchen garden on Thursday, as arranged. Dora had come with the right gloves and the right knowledge and an expression of mild, genuine pleasure at being somewhere that made sense to her. They worked side by side for an hour. The compost heap first, then a preliminary assessment of the beds, then a conversation about what might be done in spring if the drainage problem in the far corner was addressed before March. Margaret listened to Dora talk about her grandmother's garden. The grandmother had grown herbs, primarily medicinal ones, for the village. She had known the name of everything and its purpose and the right time to cut it and the right time to leave it alone. Dora had learned from watching her. She didn't explain much, Dora said. She just did it and let me watch. That's a good way to learn, Margaret said. Dora glanced at her. You learn that way too, don't you, ma'am? I've noticed. Margaret looked at her. Dora colored slightly. I'm sorry, that was. No, Margaret said. You're right. They worked in silence for a while. The garden was cold and bare and entirely itself, making no claims about what it was or wasn't, simply existing in its winter state and waiting. Margaret had always found this restful about gardens. They did not perform. Mrs. Holt doesn't like me coming out here, Dora said after a while, not complainingly, simply as a fact. No, Margaret said, I imagine not. She doesn't like, Dora stopped, started again. She has particular ideas about how things should be. Yes, Margaret said, she does. A pause. The bare apple trees stood at the far end, patient. I like it out here, Dora said. It feels like, I don't know, like nobody's arranged it. Margaret looked at the garden, at the beds and the trees and the compost heap at the far end, moved in October to a better position. Not yet, she said. Oliver's 7th letter arrived on a Wednesday. She knew before opening it that something was different. The letter was longer, she could tell from the weight of it, and it had been sealed twice, which he didn't usually do. She opened it at the writing desk in the afternoon, with the pale winter light coming through the window. He had found something. Not related to the property dispute, that was proceeding, he wrote, as slowly as such things always proceeded. Something else. He had been reviewing some older estate documents with the Edinburgh solicitors and had come across a reference to a previous arrangement regarding the East Field, an arrangement that involved a neighboring property, and that had implications for the drainage question Margaret had mentioned in her last letter. He had followed the thread. It had led somewhere unexpected. He wasn't ready to explain fully. The legal position needed more examination, but he wanted her to know he was looking into it. He had been, he wrote, looking more carefully at a great many things recently. Then at the bottom of the page, separate from the rest, in slightly different handwriting, as though written at a different time after a pause. You said the house was very well maintained. I've been thinking about that sentence. I think you meant something by it that I haven't properly understood yet. I would like to understand it. I'm not sure I've been paying sufficient attention to the right things. I'll be home within the fortnight." She read this paragraph 4 times. Then she folded the letter, placed it in the drawer with the others. She sat at the desk for a long time, looking at the window, at the garden beyond it, at the bare apple trees standing in the low winter light. She thought about the right things. She thought about whether a man who had written that sentence, who had noticed the gap in her answer and named it and admitted to himself and to her that he had not been attending correctly, was a man who might, given evidence, see what she had seen. She thought about the folded pages in the back of the drawer. She did not take them out, not yet, but she left the drawer unlocked. That evening she was in the east corridor when she stopped. She had not intended to stop. She had been walking to the library thinking about something else entirely, and she had simply stopped, in front of the portrait, the back of the canvas, the wooden frame, 26 days now. She stood in front of it in the quiet corridor and she looked at it and she thought about Oliver's letter, about paying sufficient attention to the right things, about a man 300 miles away, reviewing old documents, following a thread he hadn't known was there, finding something unexpected. She thought about the garden, about what could be recovered given the right attention and enough time. She put her hand on the frame. She stood there for a long moment. Then she let go. She left it where it was. She walked to the library, found her book, and sat in the warm chair by the window. Outside, the dark had come down completely. The grounds were invisible. The east field, wherever it was in the dark, was simply dark. She read until the fire needed attention. Then she read a little longer. On the morning of the 28th day, she came down the east corridor and stopped again at the portrait. She had been stopping most mornings now. Not for long. Just a moment, a brief, deliberate acknowledgement of the thing, the way you acknowledged a difficult fact by looking at it directly rather than stepping around it. Dora was behind her. She had been helping with the linen press and was carrying a stack of folded sheets and had been following Margaret down the corridor at a respectful distance. She stopped too. They both looked at the portrait, the back of the canvas, the frame. "Ma'am," Dora said, very quietly. "Should I turn it back?" Margaret looked at the portrait. She thought about Oliver's letter, about the fortnight, about the right things. "No," she said. Dora waited. "Leave it," Margaret said. "He should see it as it is." Dora was quiet for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," she said. They continued down the corridor, Dora to the linen room, Margaret to the morning room where the fire was, for the first time in 4 days, properly made up, because Dora had seen to it that morning without being asked, as she had been seeing to several things without being asked for the past week. Margaret sat down. She poured her tea. It was the right temperature, the right strength. Outside the window the grounds were silver with frost. Somewhere beyond the Oak Avenue the east field sat in its winter state, drainage problem and all, waiting for someone to pay sufficient attention. She drank her tea. She thought about the fortnight. The forgotten orders began on a Monday. Margaret had arranged, in the second week of Oliver's absence, a small adjustment to the kitchen's weekly provisions, a specific variety of apple from the village supplier, which kept better through winter and which she had identified in her quiet, systematic way as preferable to what was currently being ordered. She had spoken to Cook directly. Cook had nodded. The order had been placed once correctly, and then the following week had reverted without explanation to the previous variety. She noted this. Said nothing. The week after that, the arrangement she had made with the laundry regarding her personal linens, a small thing, a preference about folding, was also quietly undone. Then the morning room fire, which she had finally, after considerable patient management, gotten to the right temperature by 8:30, began arriving late again. Not every day. 3 days out of 7. Enough to be inconvenient, not enough to be undeniable. She sat in the cool morning room on the third such morning, and drank her tea and thought about patterns. This was what it was, she understood, not a series of oversights but a pattern. A patient, careful, deniable pattern, operated by people who had been doing this long enough to know exactly how much was too much and exactly how little was sufficient. They were not trying to drive her out. They were simply maintaining a certain pressure, keeping a certain temperature, reminding her in the way that required no words and left no evidence of where she stood. She thought about the folded pages in the back of the drawer. She went upstairs after breakfast and took them out. She read through them from the beginning. The portrait day 1, the tea day 4, Emma's visit days 6 through 16, the household accounts, the brooch, the morning room fire, 3 separate entries now, the laundry, the apples. She read them in order, carefully, with the attention she gave to things that contained a meaning she was still assembling. Then she took out a fresh page. At the top she wrote the date. Below it she wrote, for the first time, not a single entry but a summary, 3 paragraphs, clear and specific, with dates and details and the precise language of someone who was writing for a reader other than herself. She looked at what she had written. Then she folded it separately from the others and put it at the very back of the drawer. Oliver was coming home in 12 days. Mrs. Whitmore arrived on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced, in the way of neighbors who had known a house long enough to feel that announcement was a formality they had earned the right to skip. She was perhaps 50, broad and warm and possessed of an energy that filled a room without crowding it, the energy of someone who was genuinely interested in the world and had never seen any reason to pretend otherwise. She had called once before, in November briefly, when Oliver had still been at home. Margaret had not had occasion to speak to her properly. Mrs. Holt had shown her to the morning room with an expression suggesting mild inconvenience. Margaret had come in and found her standing at the window looking at the garden. "I hope you don't mind," Mrs. Whitmore said, turning. "I've been meaning to call for weeks and I kept not doing it, which is a habit I'm trying to break." "I don't mind," Margaret said. "Please sit down." They sat. Tea was brought. Mrs. Whitmore began to talk, in the easy, unself-conscious way of someone for whom conversation was simply the natural state of being in the same room as another person. Not performance, not strategy, just the genuine outward movement of a mind that found the world interesting and wanted to share what it found. She talked about the village, about a dispute between 2 families over a right-of-way that had been running for 11 years and had recently acquired a new dimension involving a goat, about her eldest son, who was doing something in Bristol that she didn't entirely understand but that seemed to make him happy, about the Eastfield drainage problem, which she had an opinion on, and which she delivered with the confidence of a woman who had watched that particular field misbehave for 20 years. Margaret listened. This was what she did, what she had always done, but she was aware as the afternoon went on that Mrs. Whitmore was noticing the quality of the listening, not commenting on it, simply responding to it, the way people responded to being genuinely heard, by saying things they hadn't quite planned to say, by following thoughts further than they'd intended, by finding at the end of a sentence that they were somewhere more interesting than where they'd begun. They talked for 2 hours. At the end of it, Mrs. Whitmore stood and gathered herself and said, at the door, "I don't know why, but I feel I've said more to you this afternoon than I have to anyone in months." Margaret looked at her. "You said interesting things," she said. "It was easy to listen." Mrs. Whitmore studied her for a moment, the frank, assessing look of a woman who called things what they were. "You're not what I expected," she said. "Oliver's wife, I mean. I'd heard, well, people talk, but you're not what they said." "What did they say?" Margaret asked. Mrs. Whitmore smiled, a real one, unhesitating. "Quiet," she said. "They said you were very quiet." "I am," Margaret said. "No," Mrs. Whitmore said. "You're not. You're the opposite of quiet. You're simply economical. She pulled on her gloves. "There's a difference. Most people can't tell." She left. Margaret stood in the entrance hall and listened to the carriage go down the drive. Then she went to her reading room and sat at the desk and thought about the word economical for a long time. She had been managing the garden notes herself since November, a separate notebook from the small folded pages, larger, kept openly on the desk in the morning room. Soil conditions, bed assessments, what she'd found in the compost heap, ideas for spring. Dora contributed occasionally, a note about what her grandmother had grown, a sketch of a layout she remembered. On the Friday after Mrs. Whitmore's visit, Margaret spread the notebook on the morning room table and looked at what she had accumulated. It was, she thought, a reasonable plan. Not ambitious, she was realistic about what one winter and one pair of hands could prepare, but solid. The drainage in the far corner, the south beds which had potential, the herb section nearest the kitchen door, which was an obvious want that no one had got around to addressing. She was making a note about the herb section when Mrs. Holt came to the door. "A message from the Edinburgh solicitors, ma'am," she said. "For you this time." Margaret looked up. Mrs. Holt's expression was its usual composed surface, but beneath it something was working, a small, contained uncertainty that had not been there in the same form before. "Thank you," Margaret said. She waited until Mrs. Holt had withdrawn. Then she opened the message. It was from Oliver's solicitor, a brief, formal note explaining that the Duke had asked him to send Margaret certain documents relating to the Eastfield drainage question, which he understood the Duchess had raised, and which had turned out to involve a historical arrangement with the neighboring property that had legal implications for the estate's current boundaries. Attached were 3 documents. She read them carefully, twice. Then she sat very still for a moment. The drainage problem in the Eastfield, which she had mentioned in passing in her 4th letter, the way she mentioned things she had noticed without expecting them to lead anywhere, had been caused, she now understood, by a wall built in 1834 on what was technically Merston land, by the neighboring estate, under an arrangement that had never been properly documented, and that had legal implications that the current neighboring family appeared to be either unaware of or hoping no one else would notice. Oliver had found this, had followed the thread from her single passing sentence, had sent her the documents before he'd sent them to anyone else. She read the covering note again. "His Grace asked me to note that the original observation was the Duchess's, and that he thought it important she have the relevant information directly." She put the note down. She looked at the garden notebook on the table in front of her. At the Eastfield drainage entry, 3rd page, with her small, precise annotation, "Possible wall interference, check boundary records." She thought about paying sufficient attention to the right things. She thought about a man in Edinburgh reviewing old documents, following a thread she had given him without knowing she was giving it. She took out the garden notebook, turned to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, "Eastfield boundary question. Documents received December 19. Then she put the documents in the drawer with the folded pages. On the 31st day, Mrs. Holt came to find her. Margaret was in the library, not her usual chair, the one by the window, but the far end where the older books were, the ones that had been there since before Oliver's father. She had been working her way through them systematically, in the way she worked through most things. Mrs. Holt stood in the doorway. "The Duke writes that he will return on Friday," she said. "Yes," Margaret said, "I had his letter this morning." A pause. "I'll see that his rooms are prepared," Mrs. Holt said. "Thank you," Margaret said. She did not look up from her book. Mrs. Holt remained in the doorway for a moment, long enough that Margaret became aware of it, which she suspected was the intention. Then she withdrew. Margaret turned a page. She read to the end of the chapter. Then she closed the book and sat for a moment in the quiet library with the old books around her and the winter light coming through the tall windows and thought about Friday. Oliver was coming home. She thought about the portrait in the east corridor, still facing the wall. She thought about the folded pages in the drawer. She thought about what she had decided, quietly, over the course of 31 days, in the way she decided most important things, not in a single moment but in an accumulation of moments, each one small and clear, until the weight of them resolved into something that could not be undone. She had decided two things. The first, she was not leaving. She had considered it not as defeat but as a practical question, the way she considered most practical questions. She had weighed it. She had decided that leaving was the wrong answer because it was the answer the house expected, and she was not in the habit of providing expected answers. The second, something had to change. Not Oliver. She did not think she could change Oliver, and she was not interested in the project of changing people, which was in her experience both exhausting and ineffective. But the machinery, the systems, the pattern of small, deniable pressures that had been operating around her for 6 months with the patient confidence of things that had never been interrupted. Oliver was coming home on Friday. She would be ready. On Thursday evening, she went to the small writing desk in her reading room and opened the drawer. She took out the folded pages, all of them. She arranged them in date order on the desk in front of her, 31 days, each one its own entry, the whole thing laid out like a map she had been drawing without knowing, at first, that she was drawing it. She read through them once more. Then she took out the summary she had written, the 3 paragraphs, clear and specific with dates and details. She read it. She made 2 small corrections. She recopied it onto fresh paper in her best hand. She placed it on top of the stack. She did not put it back in the drawer. She left it on the desk. Then she went to the window and looked out at the dark grounds and the frost and the place where the east field was, invisible in the dark, waiting for spring and the right attention. She was not afraid. She was not angry. She was, she thought, simply ready, in the way of someone who had been waiting a long time for the right moment and had learned, by waiting, exactly what they intended to say when it arrived. Friday was tomorrow. She went to bed. She slept. In the morning, the frost was heavier than it had been all winter. She came down the east corridor at the usual time, in the usual way, unhurried, composed, attending to what was there. She stopped at the portrait, the back of the canvas, the wooden frame, 32 days. She stood in front of it. Then she did something she had not done since the first morning she had found it. She looked at it, really looked at it, with the full, unhurried attention she gave to things she intended to understand. The frame, the hook, the specific angle at which it had been turned, which was precise, not accidental, not careless, done by someone who had meant it to be seen. She stood there for a long time. Then she nodded once very slightly to herself. The way you nodded when something had told you what you needed to know and you were finished needing it to tell you. She walked to the morning room. The fire was properly made. Dora had seen to it. The carriage came up the drive at 3:30. Margaret was in the morning room when she heard it, the specific sound of wheels on the gravel approach, the change in pace as it slowed near the entrance. She had been reading, or attempting to read. The same page, she realized, for the past 20 minutes. She put the book down. She did not go to the entrance hall immediately. She sat for a moment in the morning room with the winter light coming through the window and the fire properly made and the book closed on the table beside her, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was her method for thinking about everything at once. Then she stood, smoothed her dress, went to the entrance hall. Oliver was already inside. He looked different from how she had been holding him in her mind for 5 weeks, which was the way of people seen after absence. Not dramatically different, but there was something in his face that she hadn't had occasion to catalogue before, a tiredness that was not physical tiredness, the kind that came from having been thinking hard about something for a long time without resolution. He saw her, and something in his expression shifted. Relief, she thought, or something adjacent to it. "Margaret," he said. "Welcome home," she said. Mrs. Holt was there, managing the bags, directing the staff with the efficient invisibility of long practice. Oliver spoke to her briefly, the estate, the mail, the usual matters of return. Margaret stood to the side and watched him do it, watched Mrs. Holt receive his attention with the ease of 30 years of receiving it, watched the way the house reassembled itself around his presence. He turned back to Margaret. "Are you well?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment, the page-reading look, careful, not yet confident in the meaning. "Good," he said. "I'm glad. They went in to dinner. Dinner was correct." This was the word that kept presenting itself to Margaret as she sat across from her husband for the first time in 5 weeks. Correct. The food was correct. The service was correct. The conversation moved through its expected courses with the smooth efficiency of a well-managed household performing its function. Oliver talked about Edinburgh, the dispute which had reached a preliminary resolution, the solicitors, one brilliant and one comprehensively wrong, the city which had been colder than he remembered. He asked about the estate, the East Field, the winter preparations, the questions she had raised in her letters. She answered. She told him about the documents his solicitor had sent, about what she had found in the boundary records, about her preliminary thoughts on the drainage question. He listened carefully. He asked good questions. He was, she noted, paying attention, real attention, not the performed variety. What he did not say, anything about the portrait. What she did not say, anything about the portrait. They finished dinner. Oliver poured himself something from the decanter. Margaret declined. They moved by the established pattern in the direction of their separate evening routines, him toward the study, her toward the reading room. At the foot of the stairs she stopped. "Oliver," she said. He turned. She looked at him for a moment, the long, level, assessing look. He held it without flinching, which she had noticed before and which she respected. "The East Corridor," she said. "In the morning." He looked at her. "I'll find it," she said. She went upstairs. She heard him from the reading room. Not clearly, the house was too large for that. But she heard the specific quality of his footsteps in the corridor below, and then their absence, which was the quality of someone who had stopped. She had left the reading room door ajar. She did not know entirely why. The absence of footsteps lasted a long time. She looked at the page she was not reading. Then his footsteps again, not continuing, not returning. Different. The measured, deliberate pace of someone moving with purpose. She heard from below a door. Then a voice, Oliver's, low, controlled, not raised, and another which was Mrs. Holt's. She could not hear the words. She did not need to. She turned a page. He came to the reading room at 9:30. He knocked. This registered before anything else, the knock, the specific fact of it, the deliberate pause before the door opened. He had not knocked before, not once in 6 months. He had walked in not rudely, not thoughtlessly, simply with the ease of a man moving through his own house who had not yet fully reckoned with the fact that some of its rooms now belonged to someone else. "Come in," she said. He came in. He looked at the room, at the books, the desk, the small fire. He had not, she realized, spent much time in this room. She had chosen it herself in the first week for precisely this reason. It was small enough to be warm and far enough from the main corridors to be quiet, and it had not been anyone else's particular room before. He sat down. The chair across from the desk. He sat in it carefully, with the contained, effortful attention of a man who had decided something and was now delivering on the decision. She put her book down. They looked at each other across the small room. "How long?" he said. One word, no preamble, no framing. She had not expected this. She had expected the version that required more scaffolding, the version where he worked toward the question through several preparatory sentences. Instead, directly there. "The portrait," she said. "Yes." 32 days, she said. He was quiet. "Mrs. Holt," he said, not a question. "I don't know who specifically," she said. "I didn't investigate," he looked at her, "but you know." "Yes," she said, "I know." The fire shifted. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it finding the gaps in the old walls, the places where drafts lived. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. She had been expecting this question. She had been thinking about her answer for 5 weeks. "Because telling you would have required me to know what you would do with it," she said, "and I didn't know yet." He absorbed this. "And now," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Now you're home," she said, "and you went to the East Corridor before you came here." He was quiet for a moment. "I went to Mrs. Holt," he said. "I heard." "I asked her when it had happened." A pause. "She said she wasn't certain." Margaret said nothing. "She said she wasn't certain," he repeated, with the flat, careful tone of a man repeating something that he had understood on 2 levels simultaneously. "Which is a particular kind of answer." "Yes," Margaret said, "it is." He sat with this. She let him sit with it. She did not fill the space. Filling space was not her method, and this particular space needed to be his. He needed to sit in it and feel its dimensions and determine for himself what he was going to do with what he found there. "There's more," he said. It was not quite a question. She opened the desk drawer. She took out the folded pages and the summary and placed them on the desk between them. He looked at them. "You kept records," he said. "Yes." "Since when?" "Day 1, she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he reached forward and picked up the summary, the 3 paragraphs, clear and specific, with dates and details recopied in her best hand. He read it. She watched him read it carefully, completely, in the way he read everything. When he finished, he put it down. He said nothing for a long time. She waited. "Margaret," he said. "Yes." "I owe you," he stopped, started again. "I've been absent, not in Edinburgh, here, before Edinburgh." He looked at the folded pages on the desk. "I didn't see what was happening in my own house." "No," she said. "I should have." "Yes," she said, "you should have." Not gently, not harshly, simply accurately in the way she said most things. He looked at her. "I'm going to fix it," he said. She held his gaze. "I want to believe that," she said. "I know," he said. "You need evidence." "Yes," she said, "I do." He stood. He picked up the summary and folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He looked at the folded pages remaining on the desk, 32 of them, each one its own small record of what the house had been in his absence. "May I take those as well?" he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. He gathered them carefully, not quickly, with the deliberate, attending care of a man who understood he was handling something important. He stood with them in his hand. "Thank you," he said, "for keeping them." She looked at him steadily. "I kept them for myself," she said, "not for you." "I know," he said, "that's why they mean something." He went to the door, stopped. "The portrait," he said, not turning around. "I'll turn it back in the morning." "I know," she said. "I should have done it tonight." "Yes," she said, "but morning is all right." He left. She listened to his footsteps in the corridor. Then their absence, which was the quality of someone who had stopped at the East Corridor, she thought, though she couldn't be certain. Just stopped in the dark in front of a portrait that faced the wall. Then the footsteps again. Going, this time, toward his study. She turned back to her desk. The drawer was empty now, the pages gone. The drawer looked different without them. Lighter, she thought, though that was not quite the right word. She sat for a while in the room that was most fully hers. In the house that was beginning, she thought slowly, with evidence still required to become something else. She was not certain yet. But she was, for the first time in 32 days, not uncertain in the same way. In the morning, the portrait was facing the right direction. She came down the east corridor at the usual time and found it herself, looking back at herself in the pale winter light. She stopped in front of it the way she had stopped in front of the wall for 32 mornings. The likeness was reasonable. The painter had captured her stillness. He had not captured, could not have captured, she supposed at the time, what lived behind it. She stood in front of the portrait for a long moment. She did not nod this time, she simply looked. Then she continued to the morning room. The fire was properly made. She sat, poured her tea, the right temperature, the right strength. She was halfway through the first cup when Oliver appeared in the doorway, not Mrs. Holt, not Dora, Oliver himself, still in yesterday's clothes, which meant he had not slept or had slept in his study, which meant he had been working at something through the night. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Sit down," she said. "I'll have them bring another cup." He sat. She called for Dora. They sat in the morning room in the early light, across the table from each other, with the fire properly made and the tea properly done and the east corridor behind them, portrait facing the right way, while outside the frost held the grounds in its cold and patient grip. Oliver put his hands around the teacup. "I wrote to my mother last night," he said. She looked at him. "And to Mrs. Holt," he said, "this morning before you came down." The morning room was quiet. "What did you write?" she said. He told her. She listened. She did not interrupt. She listened in the full, complete way that Mrs. Whitmore had noticed and called economical, that Dora had noticed and couldn't name, that Oliver was noticing now for what she suspected was the first time, the quality of attention that made a person feel that what they were saying was the only thing in the world worth hearing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "That's sufficient," she said, "for a start." He looked at her. "For a start," he said. "Yes," she said, "there will need to be more over time." "I know," he said. "I'll need to see it," she said, "not be told it." "I know," he said again, and then more quietly, "I'm beginning to understand the difference." She looked at him across the table, at this man she had been trying to understand for 6 months, sorting the presented from the assumed, from the observed, from the inferred. She thought she was, this morning, slightly closer to the actual. Not there yet, but closer. "The east field," she said. "The drainage, I have thoughts about it." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, and then something warmer than surprise. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened. Outside, the frost began slowly to release its grip on the grounds as the morning light found it. The east field sat in its winter state, drainage problem and all, waiting with the patient indifference of land that had been waiting for a very long time and was prepared to wait a little longer. Inside, in the morning room, a fire burned properly and 2 cups of tea steamed in the cold air, and a conversation began that would take not days, not weeks, but months and years of accumulated evidence and careful attention to reach its conclusion. It was, she thought, a reasonable start. The week after Oliver's return was different. Not dramatically, she had not expected drama, and drama was not Oliver's register, but different in the way that mattered. The small, specific, observable differences that she had learned over 6 months to read more accurately than any grand gesture. Mrs. Holt's manner had changed. Not vanished. Mrs. Holt was too skilled for anything as readable as a complete reversal. But the particular quality of her composure had shifted in the way composure shifted when its foundations had been questioned. She moved through the house with the same efficiency, managed the same systems, gave the same instructions. But she did not, any longer, give them with the ease of someone who was certain of her ground. The morning room fire was correctly made every day. The tea was the right temperature. Margaret noted these things without comment. She was still noting. She had started a new page in the small desk drawer, not of grievances now, but of evidence. Different evidence, going in a different direction. She was not, by nature, a person who stopped paying attention simply because the immediate pressure had eased. Oliver was present in the way he had not been before his departure, not just physically in the house, but present in the fuller sense. He came to the morning room. He asked questions and waited for the answers. He walked with her in the garden on a Tuesday afternoon in the frost, while she told him about the south beds and the herb section and the drainage plan, and he listened with the complete, attending focus she had previously encountered only in his letters. She watched all of this. She told herself, building evidence. She was also, in the private accounting she kept from herself, aware that the evidence was accumulating in a direction she had not entirely planned for. The problem was not Oliver. This was the conclusion she had been arriving at slowly for the better part of a week. The conclusion she had resisted, because it rearranged the entire picture in ways that required her to revise a great many careful assessments. The problem had never been Oliver. Oliver was a man who had inherited a household that operated on systems he had not built and had never examined, organized by people whose loyalty was to an older version of what this house was supposed to be. She arrived at the word precisely, incurious. Not indifferent, not cruel. Incurious in the way of someone who has never been made to look at the machinery because the machinery has always simply run. And then he had been shown the machinery. Not by her, not directly, not as a confrontation. Through a letter about a drainage problem. Through a sentence about a well-maintained house. Through 32 folded pages that she had kept for herself and then handed to him, and which he had apparently spent the better part of a night reading in his study, because he had come to breakfast in yesterday's clothes with the expression of a man who had been somewhere difficult and had made it through. He had done what she had needed him to do, not perfectly, not immediately, but he had done it. This meant the picture she had assembled over 6 months required revision. She sat with this revision for several days, turning it over, examining it from different angles, the way she examined all important things before she decided what to do with them. On the 5th day after Oliver's return, the dowager's letter arrived. It was addressed to Oliver. He read it at breakfast, which he was now taking in the morning room. This had begun without discussion, simply as a fact, the way several things had begun without discussion in the past week. He read it with the contained, careful expression he wore when managing a strong reaction. He put it down. "My mother," he said. "I thought it might be," Margaret said. He looked at her. "She's not pleased." "No," Margaret said, "I imagine not. She says Mrs. Holt has been with the family for 30 years and is an indispensable." "Yes," Margaret said, "she would say that." Oliver folded the letter. He held it for a moment. Then he put it beside his plate and picked up his coffee. "I'm not going to change my mind," he said. She looked at him. "About Mrs. Holt," he said, "or about anything I wrote to my mother, I want you to know that." "I do know it," she said. "Do you?" She considered this honestly. "I'm building evidence," she said. "You're contributing to it." He looked at her, the page-reading look, which was, she thought, becoming more fluent. He was learning the language faster than she had expected. "That's fair," he said. He wrote back to his mother that afternoon. She did not ask what he wrote. He did not tell her, but the letter went out with the Tuesday post, and his mother's reply, which came the following Friday, was not read aloud at the breakfast table. He put it in his study. He did not mention it again. She noted this. Mrs. Holt left on a Thursday. Not dramatically. Not in tears or recrimination. Mrs. Holt was too composed for that, too skilled at surfaces. She managed her own departure with the same efficient invisibility she had brought to everything, and on Thursday morning she was simply gone, and her room was simply empty, and the house was simply different in the way of a room from which a piece of furniture has been removed. The remaining staff moved through the first day with the careful attention of people adjusting to a new arrangement. Some of them, Margaret noticed, moved with something that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it, the ease of people released from a particular kind of vigilance. Dora moved differently than she had since the day Margaret had found her in the kitchen garden. She moved, Margaret thought, the way a person moved when they were no longer waiting for something. Oliver came to find Margaret that evening. She was in the library. "How did it go?" he asked. "Correctly," she said. He nodded. He came and sat in the other chair, the one he had begun to occupy in the library without announcement, the way he had begun occupying the morning room. She was accustomed to it now. The accustomedness itself was worth noting. "Are you all right?" he asked. She considered the question. "Yes," she said, "I think I am." He looked at her. "That's the first time," he said, "that you've answered that question directly." She thought about this. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it is." He was quiet for a moment. "Margaret," he said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. "The letters," he said, "the ones you sent from Edinburgh, I valued them, but he stopped, found the word, careful, more careful than they needed to be." "Yes," she said. "I'd like them to be less careful," he said, "going forward if you're willing." She looked at him. "I'm building evidence," she said again. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking," he paused. "I'm asking you to tell me when something is wrong, not in 32 folded pages after the fact, at the time." "And if I do," she said, "what will you do with it?" "Whatever needs doing," he said. "I'd like the chance to show you that." She held his gaze for a long moment. "All right," she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not quite trust. It was the opening of a door slightly, carefully, with one hand still on the frame. He understood this. She could see that he understood it. "Thank you," he said. They sat in the library for another hour. He read. She read. The fire burned at the right temperature, which was no longer a matter of management because someone in this house now simply maintained it correctly, as a matter of course. She had thought the door was open. She had allowed herself to think, in the careful private accounting she kept, that what Oliver had done was sufficient. Not complete, but sufficient to continue on, to build more evidence, to see where the weight of it eventually settled. She had not anticipated the Tuesday. It began ordinarily enough. Oliver was in his study with the Eastfield documents. She was in the morning room with the garden notebook, planning the spring work in the specificity it required, what needed to be ordered when from whom. Dora brought tea at 10:30. The fire was correct. Oliver's mother arrived at 11. Not a letter this time. In person. The Dowager Duchess Emma Ashworth came through the front door of the Merston estate with the ease of a woman who had never stopped thinking of it as her own. And she had brought with her a quality of purpose that Margaret recognized, from their previous encounter, as the purposefulness of a woman who had made a decision, and was delivering on it. Oliver came out of his study. Margaret came to the door of the morning room. The three of them stood in the entrance hall. "I thought we should speak in person," Emma said, to Oliver, not to Margaret. The specificity of this was deliberate and visible to everyone present. "Yes," Oliver said, "we should." Emma looked at Margaret then, the jeweler's look, the long assessment. Something in it was different from their last encounter, recalibrated again, and Margaret thought she understood what had changed. Emma had received Oliver's letter, and the letter had told her something about her son she had perhaps not fully accounted for before. "Margaret," she said. "Your Grace," Margaret said. "I owe you an apology," Emma said. The entrance hall was very quiet. Margaret waited. "The portrait," Emma said. "I was aware of it. I did not instruct it directly, but I was aware of it and I did not instruct it to be undone." A pause. The precise, controlled pause of a woman who was doing something she had not done easily. That was wrong. I want you to know I know that. Margaret looked at her. Thank you, she said. Emma looked at her for a moment, something shifting, recalibrating, the jeweler's look arriving at a different assessment than all the previous ones. You're not going to make this easy, are you? Emma said. Not a complaint, something closer to respect. I'm not, Margaret said. No. Oliver was watching them both with the expression of a man, observing something he did not entirely understand, and was not going to interrupt. No, Emma said, I thought not. She looked at her son, then back at Margaret. Then she said something Margaret had not expected. I'd like to see the garden, she said, if you're willing. Margaret looked at her. The kitchen garden, Emma said. Oliver says you've been working on it. I had plans for it years ago. I never, she stopped. I'd like to see what you're doing. A long moment. Come, Margaret said. They walked the garden for 40 minutes. Emma was quiet in the garden in a way she was not quiet in houses. A different kind of quiet. Not the controlled composure of a woman managing a room, but something older and less guarded. She had grown up in a house with a kitchen garden. She knew the names of things. She had opinions about the south beds that were, Margaret found, not wrong. They did not speak about the portrait. They did not speak about Mrs. Holt, or the letters, or any of the machinery that had been operating in this house for 30 years. They spoke about the drainage in the far corner and the herb section, and what had survived the winter and what had not. It was not peace. Margaret was clear with herself about this. It was not resolution, but it was something. A beginning of a different kind of accounting, not grievances, not evidence of harm, but something else. Something that might, over time and with consistent attention, become something worth having. When they came back inside, Emma stopped in the entrance hall. She looked at the east corridor, at the portrait, facing the right way at the far end. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she turned and looked at Margaret with an expression that was not quite what Margaret had ever seen on her face before. Plainer than the usual face, less managed. You look well in it, she said. The portrait. Margaret looked at her. He chose the right spot, Emma said, the east corridor. Then she went to find Oliver. Margaret stood alone in the entrance hall for a moment. She thought about the morning she had found the portrait facing the wall, about 32 days of folded pages, about the summary in Oliver's coat pocket, about Mrs. Holt's departure and Oliver's letters and the Eastfield documents and the morning room fire properly made. She thought about 40 minutes in the kitchen garden, with a woman she had expected to remain an adversary. She thought about the door she had opened slightly, carefully, with one hand still on the frame. She thought about how she was still tired. This was the thing she had not resolved. The other things were moving slowly, with evidence required at every step, but moving. The tiredness was slower. The tiredness was the accumulated weight of 6 months of saying nothing in rooms where the nothing was required to do the work of everything, and it did not lift simply because the rooms had changed. It lived in the body, in the bones, in the specific place behind the sternum where she had been holding things carefully for a very long time. She stood in the entrance hall. She thought about this. She thought about what she needed that she had not yet asked for. Not from Oliver, she had asked Oliver for what she needed and he was, with evidence and with consistency, providing it. But from herself, for herself, what did she need? She stood in the entrance hall and she looked at the east corridor and the portrait at the end of it, and she thought about the question with the same full attending care she brought to every question that mattered. She needed to go somewhere where she could turn back around. The sentence arrived the way most true things arrived for her, fully formed, without preparation, from somewhere below the level of deliberate thought. She stood with it for a moment. Then she went to find Dora. She did not tell Oliver that evening. She told herself this was because she needed to think it through more carefully, to be certain, to build her own evidence about what she needed before she presented it. This was true. It was also true that she was frightened, not of Oliver's response but of her own, of what it would mean to say the thing aloud, to make it real, to discover whether she was brave enough to ask for what she needed even when what she needed was, in some fundamental way, a retreat. She lay in the dark that night and looked at the ceiling and thought about the word retreat. Retreat was not defeat. She had told herself this in October, when she had first understood the shape of what the house was doing. Retreat was the deliberate withdrawal of a person who understood where she was not required to remain. She had not retreated then because the right moment had not come. She thought about whether this was the right moment. She thought about Oliver, about the portrait turned back, about the letters to his mother, about the Eastfield documents sent to her first before anyone else, about 40 minutes in the kitchen garden with Emma, talking about drainage and herbs and what survives winter. She thought about the door, slightly open, one hand still on the frame. She thought about what it would mean to let go of the frame, to go somewhere and turn back around, and then to come back. In the morning she got up early. Before the house was fully awake, before Dora, before Oliver, before the correct fires and the correct tea. She dressed in the gray dawn and went downstairs and stood in the kitchen making her own tea, in the quiet that existed before a household remembered itself. She stood at the kitchen window with her cup and looked at the garden. The frost was heavy. The beds were bare. The herb section nearest the door was still a plan, not yet a reality, something for spring, when the ground softened and the right attention could be paid. She thought about her aunt's house. Her mother's older sister, who lived alone and had always lived alone with the contented self-possession of a woman who had understood early what she required and had arranged her life accordingly. Small house, good library, a garden that was genuinely hers. She had visited twice, once as a child, once in the difficult year after her father's death. Both times she had felt, in that house, the particular ease of a place that did not require her to manage herself. She thought about going there. Not forever. She was precise about this. Not forever, not as flight, not as the end of something. As a pause. As the space in which to let the tiredness ease, to let the held things settle, to remember what it felt like to be in a room that did not require the nothing to do the work of everything, and then to come back. To the east corridor and the portrait and the morning room fire and Oliver, who was learning to read the right language and making, with consistent evidence, a case she was beginning to be willing to hear. She stood at the kitchen window. She finished her tea. Then she went upstairs to the small writing desk in the reading room, and she took out a fresh sheet of paper and she began to write. She wrote for an hour. Not fast, she never wrote fast. She wrote with the care she brought to everything that mattered, finding the right sentence for each thing she needed to say, then the next, and the next, until the page held what she needed it to hold. When she finished, she read it through once. It was 4 paragraphs. The first said where she was going, and why, and for how long, approximately a month, to her aunt's house in Derbyshire, because she needed time in a place that was fully and unambiguously hers to recover something she had been spending at a rate that was not sustainable. The second said what she needed him to understand, that this was not about him, not as he was now, not about the things he had done in the past 3 weeks. It was about her. About what 6 months had cost and what she needed to replenish it. The third said what she needed him to do, nothing. Wait, write if he liked, she would write back, but not to come, not to send anyone, not to manage the situation, to simply let her be away for a month and trust that she would come back. The fourth was the sentence that had arrived in the entrance hall, fully formed. I turned my face to the wall long before the portrait did. I think you know that. I think you have always known that. I am going somewhere I can turn back around. She read the fourth paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter and set it on the desk. She did not seal it yet. She was going to tell him herself. She had decided this sometime in the night. She was going to put the letter in his hand and tell him herself, which was different from leaving it on a table, which was different from letting him find it. She was going to be in the room and say the thing and watch him receive it, because she needed to see his face when he did. She sat for a moment. Outside the window the dawn was coming up properly now, the pale winter light finding the grounds, the frost beginning its slow daily release. The kitchen garden was gray and bare and full of plans that would require spring to realize. She stood. She smoothed her dress. She picked up the letter. She went to find Oliver. He was in the study. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, surprised because it was early, because she had not knocked, because something in her face was different from the usual face, and he was, she thought, becoming better at reading the difference. She came in. She held out the letter. He looked at it, then at her. Then he took it. He read it. She watched him read it carefully, completely, with the full attending focus she had catalogued in the library and the morning room and the east corridor. She watched his face move through what it moved through. She watched him arrive at the fourth paragraph. He was still for a long moment. Then he put the letter down on the desk. He looked at her. She waited. "How long?" he said. "A month," she said. "Perhaps 5 weeks." He nodded. "Your aunt's house," he said. "Yes." "Derbyshire," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll have the carriage ready," he said. "Whenever you want to go." She looked at him. "That's all," she said. "That's all," he said. She continued to look at him, the long, level look, the full attending care. He held it. He did not fill the space. He was learning, she thought, not to fill the space. This was perhaps the most important thing he had learned. "All right," she said. She turned to go. "Margaret," he said. She stopped. "All right," he said, "if I may." She considered this. "You may," she said. "I'll try to be less careful than before," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "So will I," she said. She left on a Friday morning. Early, before the house was fully awake, in the gray cold of a winter dawn. Dora had helped her pack the night before, quietly, without comment, with the particular quality of attending that Margaret had come to value in her above most things. At the door Dora handed her her coat. Her eyes were dry. Margaret had told her not to, and Dora, unlike most people, did what Margaret told her. "The south beds," Margaret said. "In February if the ground softens." "I know," Dora said. "I have the notes." Margaret looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Dora nodded. She held open the door. Margaret went out into the cold morning. The carriage was at the bottom of the steps. The grounds were silver with frost, the Oak Avenue bare and patient, the east field somewhere beyond in the gray dawn. Oliver was at the top of the steps. She had not expected him to be there. She had thought, she had perhaps hoped, the admission was uncomfortable, that he would let her go quietly, without ceremony, without anything that required her to manage her face in the cold morning air. He was there. He had come down without a coat. He was standing in the cold in his morning clothes with his hands at his sides, and the expression he wore when he had decided something and was delivering on it. She stopped at the bottom of the steps. They looked at each other. He said nothing. He had understood, she thought, that this was not a moment for words. He had understood it better than she would have predicted 6 months ago, when she had first assessed him across 3 introductory meetings and found him a man who expressed himself better on paper. He was learning. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, very slightly, the way she nodded when something had told her what she needed to know. She got in the carriage. The door closed. The carriage moved down the drive. She looked out the window as the house receded, the long stone face of it, the entrance, the steps, Oliver standing at the top of them without a coat in the cold, getting smaller as the carriage put distance between them. She watched until the oaks closed around the drive and the house was gone. Then she turned and faced forward. She was going somewhere she could turn back around. She intended to. The first letter arrived on a Wednesday, 5 days after she had left. The carriage had taken 2 days to reach Derbyshire, and she had spent the first 3 at her aunt's house in the particular, careful way of someone learning to inhabit a space without managing it, sitting in rooms because she wanted to be in them, eating when she was hungry, sleeping when she was tired, none of it organized around anyone else's systems or preferences, or the invisible pressure of a household that was watching to see what she would do. Her aunt was 71 and had lived alone for 40 years, and had, in that time, developed the unencumbered ease of someone who had long since finished apologizing for what she required. She was small and sharp and possessed of an opinion about everything, which she delivered without preamble and without particular concern for whether it was welcome. She had received Margaret at the door on the first evening and looked at her face and said, "You look like you've been carrying something heavy for a long time." "Yes," Margaret had said. "Put it down then," her aunt said. "You can pick it up again later if you still want it." She had gone inside. Margaret had stood at the door for a moment in the cold Derbyshire evening, looking at the small house with its lit windows and its manageable garden, and its complete and indifferent self-possession. Then she had gone inside too. She was in the library on the Wednesday afternoon. Her aunt's library, which was smaller than Merston's but better chosen, assembled by a woman who had read everything in it and had opinions about all of it, when her aunt appeared at the door. "Letter," she said, "from Merston." Margaret looked up. Her aunt held it out. Her expression was neutral in the way of someone who had opinions and was, for the moment, keeping them. Margaret took the letter. She held it for a moment. Then she set it on the table beside her and looked at it. The handwriting was Oliver's. She would know it anywhere after 5 weeks of his Edinburgh letters. The letter was not thick. 1 page, perhaps 2. She had not expected him to write so soon. She had told him he might write. She had not specified when she expected him to. She had not, she admitted to herself now, entirely expected him to do it 5 days after her departure, which was before she had properly settled, before she had put anything down, before she had found the particular stillness that she had come here for. She picked it up. She opened it. "Margaret, I said I would try to be less careful. I find that is easier to commit to than to execute. I have written this letter 4 times. This is the version I'm sending because it is the most honest, not because it is the most comfortable. The house is quiet without you. I don't mean this as pressure. I am aware that quiet is sometimes what a person needs, and that the quiet you needed here was not available to you, and that this is something I failed to provide. I mean it as information. I am noticing things I did not notice before. I walked the east corridor this morning. The portrait is there. I stood in front of it for a while. I thought about you standing in front of the wall for 32 mornings without saying a word to me, and I thought about what that cost you, and I found I had to sit down afterward, which is not something I am accustomed to. I have been going through the household records, not the accounts, I have those in hand, the other records, the arrangements, the standing instructions, the systems that have been operating in this house for the past 17 years. I am finding things I should have found years ago. I wanted you to know that I am looking. I am not writing to ask you to come home. I am writing because I said I would and because I think honesty is a practice, not a declaration, and if I only practice it in the easy moments it doesn't count for much. The garden is still there. Dora is keeping the notes. Oliver, she read it twice. Then she put it down on the table and looked at the window, at the Derbyshire garden beyond it, small and bare and entirely itself in the January cold. She thought about honesty as a practice, not a declaration. She thought about sitting down in the east corridor. She thought about 4 drafts. She picked up the letter, read it a third time, folded it, put it in the small drawer of the writing table that her aunt had put in the guest room without comment, the same kind of drawer, the same position, as though she had understood without being told what Margaret needed most in a room. She took out a fresh sheet of paper. She wrote back, "Oliver, 3 drafts here. This is the 3rd. The library is good. My aunt is better. I am sleeping properly for the first time in 6 months, which tells me something I was not ready to know while I was in the middle of it. I've been thinking about what you wrote, that you're finding things in the household records you should have found years ago. I want to be precise about something. I am not angry that you didn't find them before. I was for a time, but I have put that down, as my aunt instructed me to do with heavy things. What I needed was not for you to have found them sooner. What I needed was for you to look when it mattered and to keep looking. You are keeping looking. I am noting this. Tell me what you find, not a summary, the specifics. I would like to know what the systems looked like from the inside. The herb section nearest the kitchen door will need attention in February if the ground softens. Dora knows this, but tell her I said so. Margaret, she sealed it. She gave it to her aunt's housekeeper to post. Then she went back to the library and sat in the chair and picked up her book and read, actually read, the words moving through her and meaning something for the first time since she had arrived. The letters found their rhythm. His on Wednesdays, sometimes Saturdays. Hers on Tuesdays, sometimes Fridays. They were different from the Edinburgh letters. She had said she would be less careful, and she found, with each exchange, that she was. He had said the same and kept the commitment with the consistency she had come to associate with him when he had decided something. He told her what he found in the household records, the specifics, as she had asked, the standing instructions from his mother, 17 years of them, some reasonable and some not, all of them operating invisibly beneath the surface of the house's daily life. The arrangements with suppliers that had, over time, drifted from the estate's best interests toward the convenience of the systems that had always managed them. Small things and larger things, all of them part of the same machinery she had been cataloging in her folded pages. He was methodical. She had not expected this, or rather, she had known he was capable of it, had seen the evidence in the Edinburgh documents, but had not seen it directed toward this particular subject. He moved through the records with the same careful attention he brought to the Eastfield boundary question, and he reported what he found without excusing it or dramatizing it, in the flat, specific language of someone who had decided that accuracy mattered more than comfort. She wrote back with questions. He answered them. She noted things. He responded to the notes. Somewhere in the 3rd week she understood that this, the letters, the specifics, the back and forth of 2 people doing the patient work of accuracy, was what she had needed from the beginning. Not in place of the house, not instead of being there. As the foundation of it, the thing underneath. She had not known how to ask for it. She was learning. Her aunt asked on a Thursday evening over dinner. "When are you going back?" Margaret looked at her. "I said a month, perhaps 5 weeks. "Yes," her aunt said. "You said." She refilled her wine with the ease of someone who had long since stopped measuring. "That wasn't my question." Margaret looked at her. "My question," her aunt said, "was when do you want to go back?" Margaret considered this honestly. "Soon," she said. Her aunt nodded, not surprised, not smug about it, simply receiving the information. "He's writing well," her aunt said. She had not read the letters. She simply knew, in the way of people who paid close attention, that something in Margaret was different from when she had arrived. "Yes," Margaret said, "he is." "And you?" "I think so," Margaret said, "better than before." Her aunt was quiet for a moment. "Your mother," she said, "used to say that you were born already watching, that you came into rooms and just observed everything and said nothing, and then 2 days later said one sentence that was more accurate than anything anyone else had said all week." She looked at her wine. She found it unnerving when you were small. She came around to it eventually. Margaret looked at her aunt. I didn't know she said that, she said. She said a great many things, her aunt said. She was right about most of them. She set down her glass. The man you married, is he coming around to it? Margaret thought about this. Yes, she said, I think he is. Then go back, her aunt said. When you're ready, the garden will need you. She wrote to Oliver on a Friday, I'm coming home on Tuesday. That was all. No elaboration, no conditions, no qualifier. She read it over once, then sealed it before she could add anything. His response arrived on Sunday. Her aunt's housekeeper brought it to the library with the expression of someone delivering something they had been asked to deliver promptly. Tuesday, he had written, I'll have the fire made. Then, below it, after a space. The portrait is where it should be. It has been every day. I thought you should know. She read this in the library chair in the afternoon light, with the Derbyshire garden beyond the window and her aunt's books around her, and the particular stillness of a place that had given her what it had to give. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she put it in the drawer with the others. She went to find her aunt. Tuesday, she said. Her aunt looked up from her own book. Good, she said. She spent the last 2 days differently from how she had spent the first. Not in retreat, that was finished. The retreat had done its work. She moved through the small house with the ease of someone who had found what they had come for and was now preparing to carry it elsewhere. She talked with her aunt long conversations, the kind that ranged freely over decades and returned to the present loaded with context. She walked in the garden, such as it was. She read to the end of the book she had started. On Monday evening, her aunt sat across from her at dinner and said, You look different from when you arrived. Yes, Margaret said. Less like someone carrying something, her aunt said. I put some of it down, Margaret said, as instructed. And the rest? Margaret thought about the drawer full of letters, about Oliver's 4 drafts and his East Corridor and his household records, and the portrait is where it should be, about the garden plans and Dora's notes and the herb section in February. The rest I'm taking back with me, she said, but differently. Her aunt looked at her. Good, she said, that's the right answer. On Tuesday morning she rose early. She stood at the window of the guest room and looked at the Derbyshire garden in the gray January dawn, bare and small and entirely itself, making no claims, simply existing in its winter state and waiting for spring. She thought about the Merston kitchen garden, the south beds, the herb section, the drainage in the far corner, the apple trees at the far end standing patient in the frost. She thought about things that survived winter given the right attention. She dressed. She packed the last of her things, the books she had brought, the letters, the small notebook she had started here, different from the notebooks at Merston, fuller in a different way. She said goodbye to her aunt in the entrance hall, briefly, in the manner of people who did not require ceremony, because the substance had already been exchanged. Come back in summer, her aunt said. The garden is better then. I will, Margaret said. Her aunt nodded. She held the door. Margaret went out into the cold January morning. The carriage reached Merston in the late afternoon. The light was low and pale, the thin winter kind, the kind that found the shape of things rather than their color. The oak avenue was bare. The grounds were frost, still. The house appeared through the trees in the way it always appeared from the approach, solid and large, and stating its own existence without apology. She looked at it through the carriage window. She thought, for the first time in months, that it was a good house. Not hers yet, not fully, not in all the ways that mattered, but moving toward it, evidence accumulating. The carriage stopped. The door opened. She stepped out onto the gravel. Oliver was at the top of the steps. He had a coat this time. He was standing with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders slightly less set than usual. The ease of a man who had decided not to manage how he looked, which was, she thought, its own kind of evidence. She stood at the bottom of the steps and looked up at him. He looked down at her. Neither of them spoke. This was all right. Silence between them had been many things over 6 months, managed, necessary, strategic, exhausted. This was a different silence. Inhabited. The silence of two people who had said the important things in letters and were now simply in the same place after an absence and did not need to perform anything for the occasion. She came up the steps. She stopped beside him. They stood side by side for a moment, looking at the grounds, the frost, the oaks, the east field somewhere in the distance, drainage problems still awaiting spring. "The herb section," she said. "Dora ordered the seeds," he said. "Last week. She said you'd want them in early." "She's right," Margaret said. "I know," he said. "I'm learning to assume she's right." Margaret looked at him. "That's sensible," she said. He looked back at her. "Welcome home," he said. She thought about this, about what it meant, about whether it was true, about all the ways a house became a home, and all the time and evidence it required. "Thank you," she said. They went inside. 1 year later. The kitchen garden in July was entirely different from the kitchen garden in January. This was the kind of obvious thing that stopped being obvious when you had watched the transformation happen inch by inch, week by week, from bare frozen ground to something that was now, in the full heat of a July afternoon, so completely and unapologetically alive that it was sometimes difficult to believe it had ever been otherwise. Margaret was in it on a Tuesday. She was not doing anything in particular, not working, not planning, not making notes. She was simply standing in the middle of it in the warm afternoon with her sleeves rolled up and her gloves off, and the sun doing what July sun did, which was to make everything seem more itself than it usually was. The south beds were producing. The herb section nearest the kitchen door, rosemary, thyme, 3 varieties of mint, the lavender that had been a late addition on her aunt's advice, was so thoroughly established that it had begun to colonize the edges of the path in a way that was going to require a decision about boundaries. The apple trees at the far end were carrying fruit, small still, months from readiness, but there. The drainage in the far corner had been resolved in March. Oliver had managed the boundary question with the neighboring estate with the same methodical attention he had brought to the household records, carefully, specifically, without drama. The wall had been adjusted. The field drained correctly now for the first time in years. She had stood in the east field on the morning after the work was finished and looked at the ground and thought about things that could be recovered with the right attention. Dora was at the far end of the garden, doing something with the compost heap that did not require Margaret's input and was therefore being done without it. This was one of the things Dora had learned over the past year, the particular skill of knowing which things to bring and which things to simply do. Margaret stood in the middle of the garden. She heard footsteps on the path behind her, unhurried, familiar, the footsteps of someone who knew where they were going and was in no particular rush. She did not turn around. "You're not wearing your gloves," Oliver said. "No," she said. He came to stand beside her. He looked at the garden, at the south beds and the herb section and the apple trees. "It's remarkable," he said. "It's July," she said. "Everything is remarkable in July." "That's not what I mean," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the garden with the expression he wore when he was being precise, when he had found the word he wanted, and was delivering it without embellishment. "When you arrived," he said, "it was bare, completely bare, and now." "It was January," she said. "Everything is bare in January." "Margaret," he said. She waited. "I'm not talking about the garden," he said. She looked at him steadily, the long, level look, the full attending care. He held it without flinching. He had been holding it without flinching for the better part of a year now, which was its own kind of evidence, the accumulation of which she had been noting with the same small, precise attention she brought to everything. The evidence was considerable. She had not told him this. She was telling him now with the look, in the way she told most things, not with words, because the words were not the right instrument for this particular thing, but with the specific quality of an attention that did not look away. He received it. She could see that he received it. "Oliver," she said. "Yes." "The herb section is going to need cutting back before August." He looked at the herb section, then at her. The thing that was not quite a smile, she had catalogued it across a year now, the expression that lived beneath his composed surface and came out in moments like this one, warm, unperformed. "I'll tell Dora," he said. "She already knows," Margaret said. "Of course she does," he said. They stood side by side in the July garden, with the sun doing what it did, and the herbs doing what they did, and the apple trees doing the slow, patient work of becoming ready. "My aunt writes," Margaret said after a while. "She wants us to come in September." "Both of us," he said. "Both of us," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'd like that," he said. "Good," she said. "She'll argue with you about the rosemary. She has strong opinions." "I'm developing a tolerance for strong opinions," he said. She looked at him. "Are you?" she said. "It's been necessary," he said. She turned back to the garden. She stood in it for a while, in the warm, productive, unapologetic July afternoon of it. The thing she had planned in January in a cold notebook, in careful small handwriting, when it had been bare ground and frost, and an idea about what could be recovered with the right attention. Recovered. That was the word. Not built from nothing, she had not built from nothing. She had recovered. She had taken what was already there, the ground, the structure, the apple trees that had been standing through the neglect as through everything else, and she had paid attention to it, and it had become this. She thought about January, about 32 days and folded pages and the east corridor and the portrait facing the wall, about Derbyshire and her aunt and letters with 4 drafts, and honesty is a practice, not a declaration, about the door, opened slightly, one hand on the frame, and then, slowly with evidence, with consistent and patient attention, the frame let go. She thought about what it meant to let go of the frame. It meant this. Standing in a July garden beside a man who was learning to read the right language, who had made the right decisions when the decisions had mattered, who had come to the top of the steps without a coat in January and again with a coat in February, and who had stood there both times without asking her for anything she hadn't offered. It meant the portrait in the east corridor, facing the right way every morning. It meant enough. Dora appeared at the far end of the garden path. She looked at the two of them standing in the middle of the herb section and produced the expression she had developed over the past year for exactly this kind of scene, composed, satisfied, carefully, not smiling. "Cook wants to know about dinner," she said. "Tell her Tuesday," Margaret said, which meant what it had come to mean. The good things, the careful things, the meal she planned for the evening she wanted to mark without ceremony. Dora nodded. She went back to the house. Oliver looked at Margaret. "Tuesday," he said. "Tuesday," she said. They stood in the garden for a little longer, in no particular hurry, because the garden did not require hurry, and neither did the evening, and neither did any of the things that stretched beyond it. The months and seasons of continued attention that would build, incrementally and with evidence, into something that had no name yet but was becoming, slowly and without announcement, whatever it was going to be. The sun moved in the way July sun moved, slowly, generously, as though it had nowhere else to be. Margaret put her gloves in her pocket. She turned back toward the house. "The portrait," Oliver said behind her. She stopped. "In the east corridor," he said. "I was thinking there's a better place for it." She turned. He was looking at her with the precise, careful expression of a man who had thought about something, and was delivering it without embellishment. "The morning room," he said. "The east wall. The light is better there. You'd see it every morning." She looked at him. She thought about the east corridor, about 32 mornings of facing a wall and 32 mornings of folded pages, and one morning of a portrait turned back by a man in yesterday's clothes who had been in his study all night. She thought about the morning room, the fire properly made, the tea the right temperature, the window looking out at the garden. She thought about her face on that wall, in that light every morning. "Yes," she said. Something moved through his expression, the warm, unperformed thing, fully visible this time, not beneath the surface. "I'll move it tomorrow," he said. "Move it today," she said. "Before dinner." He looked at her. "Today," he said. "I'll help," she said. They went inside. She had once turned her face to the wall in every room she moved through, not the portrait but herself, the part of her that knew what it needed and had learned, over years of careful management, not to ask for it. She had stopped asking because asking required trust, and trust required evidence, and the evidence had not been there. It was there now, a year of it, specific, consistent, accumulated in the small, precise way of things that were not gestures but practices, fires made correctly, letters with 4 drafts, a man at the top of steps in January without a coat, and in February with one, and every morning since then in the East Corridor, standing in front of a portrait that faced the right way. She had turned back around. It had taken longer than she had wanted and less time than she had feared, which was, she thought, exactly how these things went when they went right. Not quickly, not easily, but in the patient, incremental way of gardens and ground and the slow, trustworthy work of spring. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed one of our stories, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks or super chat. Your support helps us continue creating more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories.